Welcome to our panel event. I've been looking forward to this for a long time. I'm so glad you're all here. Some slightly dismaying news tonight. We're not going to have Rawa Gramatian with us this evening, and I miss her already. Rawa sits on the Climate Justice Working Group, which has had a really important role in the New York State climate process. It's been their job to figure out how to define what the law calls disadvantaged communities that are on the front lines of climate change. And she also leads a large community organization in Buffalo. So I can't even imagine what the past couple of weeks have been like for her. And on top of that, she had a family emergency come up today at the last minute that she had to attend to. But we will carry on without her. We have a terrific group of panelists for you today. And before I introduce them, I'm just kind of going to give a little bit of an overview of where we're at in New York State with climate action and kind of set the scene here. And what's happening in New York on climate policy is really important, not just at the local level, but at the global level. Federal action on climate is pretty stalled out right now. And so state policy and even local municipal policy at the city level, at the town level, at the village level is leading the way. And New York is ahead of the game on that front. There are some other states that are catching up, but we're ahead of the game. Most people know that climate change is a problem and that fossil fuels are causing that problem. But I'm not sure most people really know how deep that problem goes. There is still this idea out there that we can fix climate change by maybe driving a little less or maybe buying some carbon offsets when we fly somewhere. And it's just not the case. The science is becoming clearer and clearer. And it says that in order to stop the climate from becoming more unstable and dangerous, we need to stop burning fossil fuels almost entirely, and we need to do it soon. So the tough part is that we've really run out of time to stop climate change from happening. It is already happening. But the bright side of that is that we have non-fossil fuel technology today to create energy, to heat our homes, to get from one place to another. We have that now. It's not theoretical future stuff. And in a lot of areas, it's actually becoming cheaper than fossil technology. Another thing that is, kind of on the optimistic side, every amount of fossil fuel reduction helps. So if climate action is a light switch, it's not an on-off switch, it's a dimmer. And from where we are today, there are a lot of futures that are possible. Some are better and some are worse. And to prevent the very worst climate futures from coming to pass, we need to move off fossil fuels almost entirely in the next few decades. And New York passed a law in 2019 that requires the state to develop a plan to do just that. It's called the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, the CLCPA. And one of the things the CLCPA did is it created a group called the Climate Action Council. And for the past couple of years, that council has been working to create a roadmap for getting the New York State economy, $1.9 trillion economy, it's the size of a small country, off of fossil fuels by 2050. So on New Year's Day, they released that roadmap this year. It's called a draft scoping plan. And I'm going to ask Margot, who is our trusty Zoom technician tonight, to drop a link to that draft scoping plan in the chat. It's a long and sort of a forbidding document. It's 300 plus pages and it's got a lot of supplements and it's very technical. But the gist of it is that, we need to start now. And if the goal is to make getting off fossil fuels a smooth transition that doesn't hurt ordinary New Yorkers, and not a disruptive and chaotic transition, we need to invest money and good planning and smartness and energy into making sure that regular people can afford clean energy, that our communities and our workforce and our businesses, large and small, are prepared for the new jobs that will be created by the transition, and that they will be good jobs. So one important step in decarbonizing the state economy is making the electrical grid zero carbon. Right now, it's about halfway there. About half of our electricity comes from natural gas in the state, and most of the rest is hydropower and nuclear. So to get all the way there to a clean grid, we're going to need to build a lot of new wind and solar power, and also a lot of new transmission to get that power to areas of high demand, because the energy will no longer be coming from the same places. And we're also going to need large-scale batteries and other forms of energy storage to cope with spikes in energy demand. All that technology has gotten much cheaper in the past decade. That's the good news. But building it out is going to require space. It's going to require physical space. And we're going to have some tough community conversations about land use, especially in rural areas. And if we don't make that shift, we'll basically be voting with our feet to keep the electrical grid dependent on these huge fossil gas plants in dense urban neighborhoods that are not only double glazing the planet, they're also sickening and killing thousands of people a year through particulate pollution. And most of those people are in low-income Black and brown neighborhoods. So this is a community justice issue as well as an environmental issue. Another big step is we need to shift our heating systems and our transportation to clean energy. The biggest contributors to New York's greenhouse gases are homes and buildings and vehicles. And we can't fix the climate problem without figuring out how to shift them to cleaner technology. That technology is already out there with heat pumps, with electric vehicles. And once you have a heat pump or an EV, it's usually cheaper to run than its fossil fuel counterpart. But in order to make clean tech attractive or even possible for people, we need to make it affordable to adopt. So electricity, buildings, transportation, they all need to go fossil free. There are other pieces of the New York economy that the scoping plan deals with, but those are the big ones, and those are the ones where this touches a lot of people's lives directly. If we can manage to tackle emissions in those realms, we will not only have eliminated a lot of our greenhouse gas emissions, we will also see a lot fewer deaths and illnesses in the state every year because of air pollution. But it will need a lot of ongoing investment to pull off. And how that funding exactly is going to work, how much of it should be state funding versus private funding, that is not all worked out yet. The scoping plan lays out some possible pathways for raising funds that could go towards things like giving people incentives to weatherize their homes, replacing their fossil fuel systems. But that is still a work in progress. One more really important aspect of the state climate law is that it requires at least 35% of what the state spends on climate action to flow towards what the law calls disadvantaged communities. They're on the front lines of climate change, and they have a history of being treated like dumping grounds for pollution. And the state's climate justice working group has been working to come up with a definition of those communities. They have a draft definition out now that any New Yorker can comment on, in addition to commenting on the scoping plan itself. And one of the things that they found in defining these communities was really interesting, is that defining them is very different problem in the cities than it is in rural areas. It's in urban areas, it's easier to draw lines around a community that's poor and vulnerable and has a lot of pollution burdens. And in rural areas, the vulnerabilities and the vulnerable people are more spread out throughout the landscape. So what they came up with was a definition that includes both geographic areas and individual low-income households in order to kind of try to solve that problem. So wrapping it all up, what's next? The draft scoping plan is really important. It represents an incredible amount of work by people like Raya Salter, who's with us tonight, who are serving on the Climate Action Council, and all of their advisors and the people that have been helping them put this together. But right now, it is still just a draft. It is not final. When it is final, it will guide a lot of legislation and agency decisions. It will transform the way that decisions get made at the government level in New York State, and it will bring change to every community. And so the task at hand is to make sure that that change is for the better. And I hope that if you're with us tonight and you want to weigh in on the state's climate plans, but you're not sure how, I hope you will leave here feeling like this is something that you can do. And with that, I want to turn it over to our sponsor, Lissa Everett of Sustainable Hudson Valley, to say a few words. Melissa's group has their own climate plan for the Hudson Valley area called the Regional Climate Action Strategy. And I'm hoping you can just say a couple of words to kick us off, Melissa.
Thank you so much, Lissa. I am going to, yes, let's have Melissa say a few words. That's always really good. We've been longtime collaborators with Chronogram on projects like the Clean Power Guide. Our mission is to speed up, scale up, jazz up, and leverage progress against climate change. And so, of course, we are very excited about the Climate Act. And we really think that in any change this big, the first hump to get over is imagination. That even those of us who are working in the middle of it have trouble thinking about what needs to happen. So, a couple of years ago, a group of us thought, let's make a regional kind of strategy. We didn't want to presume to call it a plan while all the state policy was being formulated. But let's just think about basically three questions. What's it going to look like on the ground? Projects and programs that will get us there. Who needs to be involved? And what can we do to accelerate momentum? So the we ended up being about 90 stakeholders, including Gregory and some of his fellow members of the Hudson Valley Environmental Justice Coalition, Cornell Cooperative Extension, Scenic Hudson, a lot of the county planning offices. It's very much less formal, much less funded than the Climate Action Council, but really it's about unsticking the imagination. So as a result, Clearwater and Scenic Hudson have launched a program to work with local communities. They've worked with 30 or 40 at this point, looking at maps and saying, where shall we put the renewable energy that people won't be upset about? We have begun meeting with resource recovery agency managers in most of the counties to think about how we can collaborate to increase waste diversion. We have started having very intentional conversations in what we call the priority communities, to make sure that community-based organizations on the ground actually get the Climate Act and can not just be consumers of heat pumps and EVs, but can really, use the resources to set a direction for themselves. So we hope this will be of value, and we hope it will align with and really support the important state policy that we all need to pull together to get over the finish line. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Melissa. And with that, I'm going to start introducing our panelists. The way this is going to work is I'm just going to turn it over to our panelists one at a time to just say a few words about what they do on climate. And, after that, after everybody's had a chance to sort of introduce themselves a little bit, I'm going to start tossing out some questions, and we're also going to take questions from the chat. So if, as you're watching, you hear something and you want to chime in, you want to ask a question of us, of the panelists, just type it into the chat, and we'll get to as much as we can. It's a big topic, but we'll get there. So first off, I want to introduce Jen Metzger, who wears way too many hats these days for me to be able to enumerate them all. But Jen is a former state senator who worked on the 2019 state climate law that got this process all rolling. And right now she's doing policy work for New Yorkers for Clean Power and just joined the board of Environmental Advocates of New York. So Jen, if you want to say a few words.
Thank you, Lissa. I've been engaged in the fight to address climate change probably for the better part of 30 years now, which is, I can't believe it's been that much time, but all from like very different vantage points over time. Like when I started, it was fresh out of college. I worked at the United Nations Association doing public education and outreach during negotiations for the first international agreement on climate change. It was signed by 150 countries in 1992. If I had to predict then how far we would be on this issue, I would have predicted a lot farther. But years later, I shifted from the global to the super local, and served in local government in the town of Rosendale for many years, and also headed up the nonprofit Citizens for Local Power. And that work was really focused on concrete solutions and projects that were local and regional in nature, similar to the work that Melissa has been doing. It was very satisfying work, but I always felt that there was so much that needed to be done at the state level. It just couldn't be, one village at a time, one town at a time. and ran for the state Senate and had the great opportunity to serve at a time when we could really move the needle on climate. And passing the CLCPA was a top priority of mine. But now, as I always say, this is truly where the rubber hits the road. And I've been really focused these days on making sure that we end up with a strong, realistic, and effective plan that to reach our climate goals that really engages everyone in this process. Raya and her colleagues have done an incredible job on the draft scoping plan, but we really need the public and we need communities to be engaged. We all have to be working together on this and rowing in the same general direction. There are such huge benefits of the clean energy transition beyond addressing climate change. Lissa alluded to some of those benefits to public health, to our quality of life, to our economy, to communities that have been disproportionately harmed by economic, social, and environmental injustices. And we have a ton of work to do, but it is achievable and we'll be in a much better place for it. So it's an exciting project, but I'm really so thrilled that the River and Lissa have put this event together tonight, because it's exactly the kind of thing we need to be doing to really, engage everyone in this process. So thanks, Lissa.
Thank you so much, Jen. And I see some great chat questions are already coming in. It's so awesome. We will get to them. I want to introduce everybody first, though. Next up, we're going to hear from Raya Salter, who is a community advocate, a clean energy attorney, and for the past couple of years, a hardworking member of the Climate Action Council. A lot of the people on the Climate Action Council run state agencies, but the CAC also has members who are there to represent various pieces of the community, whether that be like geographic communities or the perspective of science or energy producers or the environment. And Raya has consistently been a voice on the CAC advocating for frontline communities. So take it away, Raya.
Hi, thank you, Lissa. Thanks, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us tonight. I agree 100% with what Jen said. It's incredibly important. So thank you for your interest. Thank you for your climate leadership. So yes, my name is Raya Salter. I am an energy attorney. I was trained as an energy regulatory attorney. I worked for a large law firm doing mergers and acquisitions. And then became an attorney. So I've been a regulatory attorney and advocate for both the Environmental Defense Fund, and I was a senior attorney with the Natural Resources Defense Council. I worked in Hawaii and got to do some interesting projects throughout Oceania. But many of you, I hope anyway, know me for up until this past summer as the policy organizer of the New York Renews Coalition. As Jen mentioned, the force behind the CLCPA. I was the legal observer in 2019 at the big direct action where we shut down then Governor Cuomo's office and said, we need the CLCPA, and it happened. And state action, it really is so incredibly important, because what we did in New York has echoed across the country and also at the federal level, which is something we can talk about later. So some folks know me as a longtime New Rochelle resident. I've been in New Rochelle for over 20 years. I'm the co-chair of our local environment committee. We work with, I see Natalie from NYCD 16 Environment. Hello, Natalie. If you're in the area and you want to link up with us to do climate advocacy, please connect. I'm actually Climate Auntie on Instagram. That is my platform. It's a great way to contact me. And you can call me your Climate Auntie. I feel like we're all climate family. So there's that. I've also, my newest venture is I founded an organization called the Energy Justice Law and Policy Center, which is the nation's first energy justice public interest law firm. And the web address is ejlpc.org, so you can check me there. And then, yes, I have been a member of the Climate Action Council for the past couple of years. I was appointed by Leader Stuart Cousins. And yes, I've seen my role broadly is really to be somebody who advocates for women, femmes, children, youth, climate, environmental justice, and just working with as many stakeholders as possible to make the plan as progressive as possible. And we got to push so that we can get the administration, we can help them, but we got to push and hold them accountable past, get the best, most progressive plan we can. So I'll end it there and turn it back to you, Lissa.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Raya. And next up, we have the illustrious Reverend Gregory Simpson. And Reverend Simpson, sorry?
You said illustrious. That's so funny.
I did. I called you illustrious. You are. Your whole like background is glowing. I'm in awe of your wall and the way that you're all set up here. It's wonderful. Yes, Reverend Simpson is a pastor of the Narashon Presbyterian Church in Pearl River, and also the co-founder of the Hudson Valley Environmental Justice Coalition. He's involved with a lot of climate and community and environment organizations locally, and he's also a science and technology educator with a PhD in organic chemistry. So yet again, someone with so many hats. But yeah, Reverend Simpson, if you could talk just a little bit about your local climate work.
Yeah, it's first of all, just thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this. I'm really feel very honored to be able to speak to some of the issues that are really passionate to me. I don't necessarily have a lot of things that I want to say at this point. What I really want to hone in on is, apart from the fact that I worked with Melissa for almost a year and a half, I think, on the regional climate action strategy. And my role there was involved with the environmental justice working group as kind of a convener, if you will, of some of those meetings. The most important thing that I'd just like to leave you with about me is that I'm really passionate about the connection between environmental justice communities or disadvantaged communities, whatever language people want to use now, and science education. Not only community science, but also real science. I mean, high school level science, graduate level science, university level science. The problems that we're facing right now are centered in our understanding and application of scientific principles. And therefore, communities who don't have access to that knowledge and don't have access to that type of information will always run or become very dependent on others to solve the problems that they experience in their environment. I'm passionately dedicated to figuring out ways for communities of color in particular to be more engaged in and more exposed to science and technology, primarily as an advocacy lens or platform on which to build out other civic engagements. So that's really rounded out kind of my focus in environmental justice. As Lissa said, I'm co-founder of the Hudson Valley Environmental Justice Coalition. I serve on the SUNY Ulster Community College Board of Trustees. I'm on the board of Riverkeeper. I sit on the board of Hudson Clearwater. I'm also the co-chair of the advisory board of an organization called Center for Earth Ethics. That's housed at Union Theological Seminary, where I did my seminary studies. And most important, at least for me, surrounds my faith and my work there. I serve as the pastor of Narashon Presbyterian Church, as well as serving on a more national level, national church level. I serve as the chair of the Environmental and Climate Change Subcommittee, and that's a shareholder advocacy group that engages companies at C-suite and board level individuals in relation to what they're doing around environmental, social, and governance issues, ESG policy frameworks. And that's in and of itself is centered on understanding the ethical and the moral imperatives of of the church in relationship to our investments. So that's kind of the broad ambit that I work in, and now very, very, very closely involved with more the education piece and trying to figure out ways to really strengthen that as a part of the CLCPA. Thank you.
And in your spare time, I neglected to mention you were a town council member in the town of Hurley, right?
Yeah, in my spare time, I do that.
Your copious spare time. Oh, wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much. Yeah, I think I'm gonna kick us off with a few questions here, and then we're gonna turn over to the chat. But I wanted to ask everybody. I know you've all been, involved in different communities across New York State, and you're all part of a lot of very different communities, and as am I. And I want to know what you're hearing from people in the communities that you're closest to about climate change, and also about climate policy, climate action. What are people most concerned about? What are people most worried about? And what message is coming from people kind of at the ground level that the state should be paying attention to?
Do you want to?
Who wants to jump in first? You want to go, Raya?
Oh,
I thought I heard you say something, so
well,
I'm picking on you.
Yeah, you always know you've got a polite and humble panel when people hang, and that's rare, folks.
I will absolutely call on you and put you on the spot if you don't volunteer yourselves.
It's a rare occurrence. But yeah, quickly, I think the message I get from a lot of activists is one of urgency. I think, urgency, wanting to see the state, the country, wanting to see, the state walk the walk on climate action and on environmental justice, and climate justice in particular. I also feel pretty strongly that certainly in New Rochelle and other areas, people are very concerned about development. They're concerned about the economic development initiatives. As folks know, throughout Westchester, it has been, in all, White Plains, New Rochelle, Yonkers, it's been this explosion of development and a lot of criticism about how equitable it is and how are we going to turn the corner to sustainable development and sort of sustainable and equitable development. And how will these funds, how are we going to fund this? We're starting to see money come from the bipartisan infrastructure law. We're starting to see, but folks are thinking, how am I going to be a part of this? Am I going to be a part of this? And is anything going to change direction? So that's my answer.
So, I would say, kind of beyond the advocate community, just, people in my community and around, I think that, most people are really concerned about climate change. But it's really big and hard to kind of, wrap their heads around, and there are like really immediate concerns that people are focused on in their daily lives. And, things like, COVID, pandemic, gas prices. But, there is a story to be told that connects the dots, like connects those issues to climate, to our over-reliance on fossil fuels. But those stories, but those connections aren't really being made enough. And so people aren't really aware of them. Lissa, you do a great job for the Rivers audience of connecting dots. You're like superb, but it's got to be on like a much more massive scale, because all of these relationships, they're very concrete things, but the conversations aren't being had. I don't want to speak for your church, Reverend, but they're not being had at my community center or at the farmers market or in other places. And a lot of people they don't understand even that the electricity, that their spikes in utility bills are the direct result of our over-reliance on fossil fuels and spikes in fossil fuel prices related to world events and the like. But utility rates are kind of like, who understands utility rates? Not a lot of people.
Nobody. No, it's literally nobody.
So anyway, I feel like that's the mission. And at the same time, I'm sorry, I'm going to stop in 1 minute, but there's like this counter force happening, and I saw something about it in the chat. But I've gotten friends, community members forwarding me emails today from their propane company and their different propane companies, with this like full of misinformation about what's in the climate plan, trying to scare people. So these companies, and it all comes from these larger, fossil fuel industry campaigns, all of this information, but it is getting into people's homes and into their businesses, and like there's nothing to counter it. There's nothing out there publicly to counter that information, except for thing like this kind of event and what we're doing as individuals, and we're losing ground, and I'm very concerned about that.
I gotta say, Jen, the propane stuff breaks my heart, because I keep talking about this with people. Like, the relationship that people have with their propane supplier is kind of personal, right? Like, if you have natural gas in your house, it comes through a pipe. Who knows? The utility brings it. Nobody loves their utility. Even people who have a decent relationship with their electric bill don't love their utility. Nobody loves it, right? But with the propane guy, it's like that guy comes to my house, I wave hello at him, right? When I moved into my house in 2013, I replaced an old fuel oil burner with a propane furnace, because I was like, this is going to be more efficient. It's going to be, it's going to be better to heat my house. It's not going to be as dirty. Like, there were definitely environmental concerns going for me when I did that decision. And I leaned on these guys for their expertise with that. And now they're coming to me being like, New York State wants to force you to spend tens of thousands of dollars on your house. And it's like, that's not true. But you're breaking my heart. They're great. And there's a lot of jobs that are happening right now that are being created in the HVAC industry by the rise of heat pumps, which there's one that I just recently had put in. I'm very happy with it, but it was not easy. It was not something that was like an easy financial decision for me. I have a big old weird house, and I took on a loan to do it, and not everybody can do that. I've been more than happy to talk about my own personal like heat pump switch thing, and I cannot tell you how many people, either River readers or people who just know me in the community, are like, not even necessarily people that are worried about climate change, but they're just like, oh, hey, that's cool. How can I do that? You have the same thing, does air conditioning in the summer and heating in the winter, and like it saves you money on your monthly bill. Like, absolutely. How can I do that? So like people are excited about that. And yet, like, there's all this like FUD, right? Fear, uncertainty, doubt being spread by by fossil fuel companies that are saying, the scoping plan means that the state is going to come and seize your gas boiler, and it's not the case. But it's very easy to kind of prey on that fear and take a policy recommendation that says we need to find ways to like subsidize this transition. We need to find ways to enable people to weatherize their houses and to like put heat pumps at cost parity with fossil fuel burners so that we can switch over a few decades all of the New York's ancient inefficient housing stock to a better path. Like, that message is long and complicated, and it gets boiled down in by like fossil fuel industry messaging into they're coming for your boiler. So there's a lot of fear in my community about that. There's a lot of fear about rising energy prices too.
No, I think that's right. And I just wanted to mention there are many very concerted misinformation and scare campaigns. And I put in the chat the link to one of the most prominent. So this is a group that is organized, is very well funded, and is actively supporting and doing exactly what Lissa and Jen have described. So just one needs to be aware of what the opposition is doing.
I want to hear from the Reverend too before we get too far down this rabbit hole, because I will geek out about heat pumps all day long.
Well, what I was going to say is that it's interesting listening, because there's always different perspectives and different socioeconomic perspectives that we're dealing with. If you're talking from the perspective of somebody who owns a home, that's one perspective. But if you're talking from the perspective of somebody who rents a home, that's a totally different perspective altogether. I mean, you're not at that level, you're not talking about, you know, how much can I afford to go out and get as a loan. You're talking about being dependent on somebody who owns the property and finding money to pay the rent. And so we have these disparities in terms of just how we engage this whole problem of renewables and what it's going to look like going forward. So for some of the people that I'm talking to, for example, their concerns are about the cost of gas, because that means that they can't get to work. They're concerned about now baby formula. That's a real issue that people want to figure out. I have in my congregation, there's an individual who works in the prison system, and what he's experiencing there, you know, when we talk about climate change, what he's talking to me about, climate change pales in comparison. He's concerned about the increased violence that is in the prison as a result of changes in regulatory, in the legal framework that allow prisoners who are more violent to be now in the general population. So the concerns are different in different populations. This community that we're speaking directly to here is very sensitive to issues in relation to energy. Environmental justice or disadvantaged communities, that's not the focus. What we want, or what they want, or what different people want is a living wage. Want to make sure that they can get to work. They want to make sure that they have education. They want to at least a bare minimum of education so they can move along the economic pathways. So I think when we think about what people are worried about, it's really siloed. It depends on where you sit in the economy. And at the lower levels, the criteria are way, way different than as you kind of move up the line. I mean, the people that I'm talking to, they're not even, the discussion about a heat pump is not in the equation at all. That's not a part of their dialogue. CLCPA is definitely not a part of their dialogue. And we have to understand that and some way, somehow translate that, the urgency of the energy crisis now to individuals who don't see it as a connecting point to what's happening in their world. That's the challenge that I see. But I don't see, from the people I talk to, I don't see their worries not around energy and CLCPA.
I think that insight that, you know, these issues don't seem connected always is just, it's so real. And, you know, where I am, I think in my very far-flung rural community that essentially has no public transportation and that frankly has very little a rental market. Like it's very difficult to find long-term rental housing. So you do have, you know, lower income people owning their own homes, but kind of stuck in place and being pushed out by gentrification. And it's just a very different picture than, you know, than the kind of vulnerabilities that you would see in a city. And I think that we have a lot of climate concerns out here that people don't see as climate concerns. I think, you know, the cost of energy hits people very hard because they're so reliant on having a personal vehicle to get anything done and to stay alive in the winter, to heat their houses. And also even the shape of our climate disasters. You know, we had Hurricane Irene flooding was just epic, just so devastating in my area. In my own town, it knocked out the grocery store that pretty much everybody in a 45-minute drive radius depends on for 9 months of the year after the flood. You know, people died in that flood. It knocked out infrastructure all over the place. It was devastating. People don't necessarily see that as a climate event, but these events are climate events and they're going to become more and more intense. And every time we have one, it taxes the local first responder infrastructure as well. That's become a little bit more real to me since I've started volunteering on the local fire department. And so all these concerns that people have very intensely in my area are, their energy concerns, their climate concerns. People don't necessarily connect them to climate action or to, the geopolitical scale of world events, even though that's what's driving energy prices, both for electricity and for fossil fuels higher. So yeah, and when people have urgent needs, life needs, daily, am I going to make it through this week or this month needs, they're not going to be thinking about, oh, what's the best heating system I can put in my house? You're right. It's not even on the radar. People are concerned about how they're going to survive. And, sometimes that does intersect with climate, but I think it's not always obvious how.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. I know that the connecting points is where the challenge is, because they're desperate. It seems like they're all non-connected, that they're desperately far apart, but it's all based on an individual's life. It's one person's life and how they interact with society. And therefore, there are all these connecting points, but if that's not the priority, or these kind of policy statements are not the priority in my life, then why would I waste time? I'm more interested in my health, for example. Somebody spoke to me about this, that, I'm concerned about, there's cancer in my family. There are areas in Hurley where there are cancer clusters as a result of water quality, for example. Poor water quality, and it's well known, it's understood, but there's not the connecting point. The reason to make that connection isn't made, and there's worries about that. There's a whole nother dynamic that relates to health in EJ communities that we need to be aware of. The link between air pollution and cardiovascular disease, for example, or neurological development. That's another issue. Might not be as prevalent further up in the Hudson Valley, but in areas like Poughkeepsie and in Newburgh that are closer to the highways, anywhere that's the proximity is closer, you're going to have these worries. And so I think the idea of creating those connecting points is absolutely essential. And how we do that is by engaging community.
Right.
Something that really struck me in attending the hearing in Peekskill that the state held on the Climate Action Council's scoping plan. And they initially weren't going to have one in the Hudson Valley at all. And then they decided, okay, you know what? They got some pressure. They got some pushback from some of us in this Zoom chat and some other folks as well. And they said, you know what? We're going to have one in the Hudson Valley. And they scheduled one for Peekskill. I attended that hearing. And one of the things that really struck me about that hearing was how many people came to talk about the Wheelabrator, which if you're not from that area, you might not be super aware, but that is a facility that burns trash. It burns most of the trash for Westchester County, and it is located in Peekskill, and it is causing health problems in the community. And, again, maybe not obviously a climate issue, but the work of the draft scoping plan is actually bringing some of this stuff to light in making the connection.
It's a climate issue. Wait, sorry.
It's not obviously. It's not obviously.
Okay.
I didn't mean to say it's not a climate issue. I meant to say the connection isn't obvious to people, but that's right. The research is pretty clear that this kind of blew my mind the more I dug into it. The more there's no lower level of safety with air quality. There's no level of air pollution at which it doesn't impact your health. And anytime you burn stuff, whether that's fossil fuels or the trash of Westchester County, it creates health problems. And scientists can measure the level of air pollution that there is in the air and draw a very tight line between that and the level of premature death that they will see in the community every year. It is astonishing to me. Not all correlations in science are that tight, but for that reason, climate is a health issue. even if you don't take into account the health costs of disasters. I'm rambling a little bit. I was getting around to a question, but hearing so many people in Peekskill come to talk about, this specific facility burning trash in their neighborhood, that's a climate issue for them. It struck me like people on the local level have this expertise about how energy and climate and pollution are impacting their lives. And even if they don't, have the technical capacity to delve into 300 pages of scoping plan and all of the technical appendices that go along with it and understand the energy market, which is a bear, right? Like, even if they don't have that, they have expertise in their lives. They have expertise on how they're being impacted by climate change, by energy decisions, by pollution, by all kinds of things. And I wanted to throw that out there to our panelists. Like, what kinds of expertise do you think ordinary people in communities have that the state should be listening to?
The idea that communities have the answer, the idea that, oh dear, it looks like I meant to unplug the phone. So, but I was going to say is the idea that communities have answers and that expertise goes beyond, having degrees is really, in community-based and community-centered policy really is one of the core tenets of environmental justice, and environmental justice practice. So I'm really glad that you brought that up. Something I also want to mention, in Peekskill, there were very, very few, Black people in the room. And one of the few who did come up to speak about the wheelabrator very specifically said, this is not right. This is really bad. But I'm here. I wish there were so many other folks who could be here, but they can't be here because they got to be at work on afternoon on this day. And that's just real. And that certainly, the Energy Justice Law and Policy Center is dedicated to the premise that communities have the answers, and we have to have frontline leadership in climate policy because the people closest to the pain must be closest to the power, nothing for us without us.
Right. And on that point, there are the public hearings were, scheduled at a time that was very hard for a lot of people to go. The vast majority of hearings were during a person's work day, or starting during a person's work day. And the hearings are not enough. There's still opportunity. It doesn't have to be a formal hearing, but conversations like community forums and conversations and reaching out to communities and to leaders within communities, and like creating a space where these things can be talked about, like in a conversational setting. And I think that is like where you can really draw on that local expertise and really draw on that local insight. But there hasn't been a lot of opportunity, and just, posting a 330-page document is not going to elicit the kind of, input that's needed at that level. And, part of it is a function of time frame. There isn't a ton of time. The Climate Action Council only has from, they have to finalize a plan by December 31st. But this is critical. And I agree. Her testimony was among the most powerful at that hearing. And, tying that to the fact that we burn, 15% of our trash in New York State, and then burn a lot of it elsewhere outside of the state, and that we have actual solutions to that, like that should all be reflected in the scoping plan. And there's so much rich information out there like that to gather.
I was just
go ahead, Reverend.
Sorry, yeah, I was just going to add as well that, Melissa and the group who worked on the regional climate action strategy, one of the things I think we all concluded was that there was a weakness in terms of our engagement with community. There's one project that I just want to lift up in relationship to this PFAS study. It's a PFAS study that's being done in Newburgh. And it's a collaboration between the Newburgh Clean Water Project, Riverkeeper, Orange County Department of Health, City of Newburgh Wastewater Department, NAACP Environmental Working Group, EDDie. It's a new organization that's housed at New Paltz. A number of environmental advocates, Sustainable Hudson Valley, and the Newburgh Urban Farm and Food Cooperative, as well as the University of Albany. What that speaks to is the level of communication and the level of collaboration that needs to take place to solve this one problem, the issue of PFAS in people's bodies. This is how it's going to be addressed. Several organizations have come together to produce documents, but not only documents, community engagement and teachings and learnings and informational sessions throughout this project. That's how it's going to have to be done. Now, if you can dumb down this scoping plan where you have that type of input, then you have an opportunity, even given the time frame and the time constraints, you have an opportunity to share a little bit more with the community at large. Again, though, one of the key things is to make this bridge between what my needs are and what these other needs are if I don't have an economic pathway to make it make sense, right? That's really important to understand. And even if you say that a community or individuals in a community are already resilient enough to work through the problems of the climate. They don't need a scoping plan to figure that out. They're living right now. They don't need that to help with that solution. They're doing what they have to do right now. The question is, how can we strengthen that knowledge base so that they can see more of what needs to be done to further the agenda of protection of the environment and the planet? That's what we need to be thinking about. And I think the larger scale collaborations and dialogues between a number of stakeholders is one of the pathways to get that done.
And can I say that as somebody who is I'm very passionate about, public education on these issues and has done a lot of work, sort of popular education, popular policy education, and a member of the council, I see there's one of the main things I've been focusing on the council is pushing for more popular education. And actually, this is something Jen and I have talked about. How can we push for more resources for exactly what, Reverend Simpson is talking about? I saw someone was saying we should be commenting, and urging the state to do that. And I couldn't agree more.
I just, the whole education, aspect of this is very real to me, and from one very particular angle. I don't think news and journalism is necessarily education, but it does foster education. It fosters greater knowledge. I think when people say education, I think they have a more targeted view of what that is generally than journalism, and journalism is just as likely to be kind of unruly and inconvenient as anything else. But but one of the factors here that we're up against is that there's such a real death of local news in so many communities, and this certainly includes my very rural community, which is a huge information vacuum. It's lost a lot of homegrown local media over the past few decades. But also, I think in more densely populated areas, you have news outlets really kind of neglecting certain audiences and really focusing on audiences that are easier to monetize. We see that up here too. We see it across the Catskills and the Hudson Valley. There's a lot of media, there's a lot of chatter, there's a lot of like clickbait articles about where to buy a house in Delaware County, right? But like, who's covering the town meetings, who's covering the county board meetings? And these are actually where climate conversations are happening. Towns and counties in the rural Catskills where I live are passing resolutions about we need to stop climate action, we need to stop the CLCPA, we need to stop the scoping plan. And they're very, I can see them reading these documents, they're like very informed by kind of fossil fuel misinformation, but that's not all it is. There's also these very like relatable, understandable fears about energy blackouts, fears about energy costs, and around here, it's not uncommon to see 3, 4, 5 day blackouts in the most rural places, even as it is. And so the fear that like climate action will mean more of that is very present to people. And when they hear local electric cooperative people coming before the town board or the county board and saying, this is going to be terrible, like they're going to put a lot of weight on that. And I think those concerns need to be heard about reliability and cost. That conversation needs to happen. Right now, that conversation is happening in kind of a stilted and narrow way because we don't have a lot of news media looking at it. We don't have public engagement with our local government as a result of there not being a lot of news and a lot of understanding of what's going on. And so we're having these conversations, but we're kind of having them in the dark. And the rest of the state isn't paying much attention to the conversations that are happening here. They're happening in this siloed way. And, that's the dynamic here. There's other communities where the dynamic is very different, but like, the conversation, the quality of the conversation and the education and the local information that needs to happen in order to have a good conversation. There are so many places in that state where we're not there.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I'm so working with a town board member in a town that wants to pass one of those resolutions of opposition and is looking for information to counter the misinformation. But what I've been really trying to emphasize is like, look, you have a very legitimate and important perspective to offer as a rural community. You have specific concerns and issues that relate to living in a rural community that could be missed and are in some ways being missed. And this is your opportunity to like constructively engage in this process and, rather than rejecting the whole thing and calling it, just opposing it, engage in the process constructively and really focus on those issues that have to be addressed and that you want to see prioritized. But it's that there needs to be, again, this goes back to the education and information piece. Like they're not starting from a knowledge base about all of this stuff. So it's very hard, and a lot of it is complicated about the grid and everything else. So it's a conundrum, that education really has to be there for people.
There's very limited funded efforts for environmental education broadly, for conversations like this, as I'm sure the organizers know. So much of the groundswell, the convos that do happen are, done by volunteers, done on a shoestring versus a very well-funded, really, there's very little answer to the very, very well-funded industry line. Something I also like to remind folks, and it's encouraging as it is daunting about education and popular education, that in a way, we really are at the dawn of climate advocacy, because while advocates are in our bubble and, so-and-so knows and so-and-so doesn't know, the truth is that the vast majority of folks in the first instance really don't know, and aren't aware, and haven't been asked. I think Yale School for Climate Communications has done a lot of interesting research about groups of people, Black, white, Latinos in particular, different classes, zip codes, in terms of, have people been asked to take action on climate and would they be disposed to do so? And I think the good news is that if asked, a lot of people would be inclined to do so. And so that's really great. And another thing is that when you think about, it's true about, I think, pretty much just about everybody is what I'm saying. It's true about most of us.
I want to add this other piece about education, which is really interesting. So education, and I think, Lissa, you said this at the start, that education means different things to different people. You're talking about education from the perspective of news or some media outlet, or maybe you get your information online. My interest right now where I am is about education K to 12. Because K to 12, if we can get our kids to understand K to 12, what it means, what this climate change issue means for the future, then we have individuals who become the policy makers. Even though they roll into a cog, they might have a voice. I mean, I gave a lecture once at Columbia Law School where we talked about what those lawyers like yourself were going to be doing in relation to climate when they sit in those boardrooms and have decisions to make and the legal frameworks and all of this kind of stuff. The question there is, if there's something in the back of your mind, knowing the law, but also something in the back of your mind that says, yeah, fundamentally this is wrong. And I know that the law does this, but maybe I can convince this individual, this client, to do otherwise. I'm saying that because I know that right now there are over 2 million students in the high school system, the K to 12 system. They're in New York State. There are over 2.5 million students, right? There's a big problem. There's a vacuum. One of the problems there is that the science education that they're being exposed to, the majority of them, particularly Black and brown kids, are not passing those courses. What does that tell you? That tells you that when it comes time to engage in the jobs of the future, these are technical jobs of the future, you're going to have a problem. At the community college level, we see the same problem, where we have to do, the college readiness is not there, so kids can come in, but they're not ready to be in university or at a community college, and they're definitely not ready to engage the workforce in technical vocations. If this entire system, if we understand what it means to educate K to 12 and above, that in my mind is a big starting point towards solving this knowledge, this information gap, this education gap. If somebody understands what benzene does to your body, has a better understanding of what it does to your body, they're likely to make different choices. If they don't, it doesn't matter. Now that this PFAS study is going on in Newburgh and more people are becoming sensitized to their environment and what PFAS does in terms of its residual effect in blood, then all of a sudden there's a different way. You can't unlearn what you learned. People understand, when you start to get it and you start to act differently, you don't have a choice. Or, well, I guess you can choose, but to your detriment. And all of that, in my mind, is predicated on the weak system that we have for public education, especially when it relates to science education, science, technology, engineering, and math. There is a huge vacuum, a huge problem that I don't think in the CLCPA, in the draft scoping plan, this is missing. There is language about what should happen, changing curricula and all of this in the scoping plan, but I don't see the action taking place that will result in a real change there. That's my concern.
Yeah, and to speak to the plan, it's one of the reasons that I recommended or really pushed the state to at least add the recommendations, the panel recommendations, as an appendix to the plan itself, because you see in the scoping plan, which has a lot of things to like, but it has in its scenario presentations a lot of lack of specificity. And there was a lot of discussion about addressing some of these issues that you're talking about in some of these subpanels. And I think that it also hasn't been helped. This is just for folks to be aware that Jim Malatras was the appointee to the Climate Action Council, who by Governor Cuomo, who was I believe he still is, there's been something there. I think maybe he's resigning as a chancellor of the CUNY system, but he is no longer on the council. So there's been kind of a vacuum, from the state, from not CUNY, from the SUNY system. And he's actually been replaced, I think, by a union representative. So I'm just letting folks know it's just a really important area to keep pushing on.
Yeah, the education piece is incredibly important. You can't, and I'm not talking about education, general knowledge. I'm talking about getting people trained properly from very early, K to 12, middle school at the lowest. We need to start focusing very clearly on middle school kids so they understand all of these issues that we're talking about.
And just to add to the urgency and magnitude of the point that you're making, you know, the job study of the Just Transition Working Group estimates that if we stay on track to meet our emissions targets, we'll create almost 190,000 jobs in New York by 2030. But who is filling these jobs in the next 8 years? I mean, we don't have the people to fill those jobs as it is. So that really has to be like front and center. And for people doing comments on the scoping plan, these are 2 points that are really worth emphasizing, that need to start happening like yesterday. And that is, you know, a major workforce development plan statewide, integrated with SUNY, BOCES, we have all of these great institutions and programs. We just have to like get it going, and the broader education piece.
Yeah.
And there were a couple of great bills that they didn't go anywhere when I was in the Senate on climate curriculum for K to 12, but that's really critical too, in the environmental justice component of that. It's important that, you know, that there is a broad understanding that that is part of our public education. So
couldn't agree more. There was a lot of discussions, a lot of great ideas came forward, and yeah, they're kind of sitting in appendices.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I want to start shifting us back towards, you know, taking some more questions from the chat, just because we've got about 20 minutes before we've got to wrap up here. And I want to get to some of the stuff that people were talking about. There was one question from a while ago about electrifying school buses. And I saw that question come in, like, how can we get school buses electrified? And it gave me a little burst of like, oh, there's actually good news on this front. Is anybody here super knowledgeable about the you know, the state of play of electrifying school buses in New York State?
Well, I know that there was there's been some progress in the first instance, in that some provisions requiring, I think it's within 5 years, were put into the state budget this year. And there are, so we should be seeing some progress on electrifying school buses. And there are many really strong groups who are campaigning also really hard on this issue. Why we got that in the budget, but it's an important issue, and you can, there are folks to get together with if you're passionate about it.
by 2035, all school buses will be electric in the legislation in the budget. So that was passed. And by 2027, all sales have to be electric.
Yeah, that 5 years.
So,
yeah,
but the funding issue is the biggest issue to accelerating it. There is a provision. So the Environmental Bond Act, very important. It's going to be on the ballot in November, but includes $500 million for school bus electrification. It's Electrify New York estimates that we need like $300 million a year to help school districts make that shift, so it doesn't impose such a huge, so it is a manageable transition and doesn't overburden property tax payers. But it's very important, the Environmental Bond Act, to vote for, because that funding will really help school districts make that switch.
See what happens.
But I love it. I love it when people are like, tell me some climate good news, and I actually can. There is climate good news. It's such a weird realm, because there's so much kind of techno optimism, some of which is actually warranted, and there are actually real solutions that are moving forward. And there's also just so many roadblocks and so many dead ends and so many cases where you see people looking at the facts and going, what, not going to do anything about this. And it is unbelievably frustrating. So, it's a weird emotional roller coaster to pay attention to climate, to pay attention to climate policy. I have so much respect for those of you who've been in it for a long time, because I've been on this beat for a year, and it's like I need more therapy than I'm getting. But you know, it's a wild world. Somebody else asked about heat pumps and about making them affordable, and are there programs that will make them affordable for low income folks who are at the level where they're on HEAP. I know I took advantage of a subsidy in getting my heat pumps in, but it was in no way, it did not make them cheap. You know, it took a few grand off the cost of, I'll be totally frank, it cost me about $17,000 to put in 5 heat pumps in my old weird drafty Victorian, which would not have been as expensive if it was a smaller house. And I was able to put it on a loan, but you know, not everybody can do that. And I want to know if there are folks who on the panel that know about, you know, programs that are accessible at the lower levels of income, and does that exist yet anywhere in the state?
Let me also say the programs that are for, you know, for homeowners are also unfortunately insufficient. In fact, was it just last week or the week before, we got a sudden notice for those of us in the Con Edison territory that they'd come to their limit to their funds for several important programs. So we're kind of we're in trouble there. And you know, however, there are some good programs. There aren't enough. I think one of the macro issues that I'll briefly mention about this that we're really, and I've just been put on the gas transition subgroup out on the council, is what we're really in a dogfight, I don't know what else to call it, with the fossil gas industry in particular, that is heck bent on keeping their infrastructure, heck bent on having the state and ratepayers invest billions and billions and billions of dollars to do just that, featuring what many think are experimental technologies, vis-a-vis, and I mention that because that is vis-a-vis an investment in a system that really strategically deploys on that neighborhood, you know, and community level, a mass deployment of the right kind of heat pump, be it usually ground source is better, but it has to be done at scale and thought about in advance. So there's a lot that needs to be done to focus on smart scaling of heat pumps.
Mhm. Mhm.
I do want to mention that in the bipartisan infrastructure bill, there is new funding for the weatherization program for low-income households, that it's been expanded to include heat pumps. That's what I understand. So I don't know where that funding is right now in terms of making its way to the state agencies, but there is some new funding available. And yeah, what Raya said about Con Edison territory is same for Central Hudson. Just in February cut its incentives in half because it met its quota. Don't even get me started on that whole new profit broken like profit incentive for utilities to help with the clean energy transition. It really, but that needs to be addressed. Utility programs, incentive programs obviously have to be beefed up a lot. But I also just want to, put out, I guess a plug for the Empower program, which not that many households participate in. I can't remember the number, but it's a small fraction of low-income households in the state. But essentially, this isn't heat pumps, but heat pumps have to go hand in hand often with weatherization and energy efficiency improvements, so that you're really realizing the full efficiency and economic savings that you can. And that's all covered. All of the costs of those improvements are covered by the Empower program. And renters can participate in it, but there's always that problem of the landlords have to be willing to have the work done to their house. But but the costs are covered, or, you know, it's highly subsidized program. So
Actually, I'm glad that Empower was mentioned. I've been and like someone who's gone out to the community and tried to, you know, get increased adoption of the Empower program. And this is another, especially when we're talking about, you know, multifamily buildings, housing, and renters. There is so much need to streamline how these programs are done, to increase information and education about them, and to actually have funded coordination. Like, you know, it can't just be, you know, that I go to the senior center or I knock on the door and then the person comes to the door and they need to get so much paperwork. They need to get so much paperwork online. They need to get the permission from their landlord. And it's actually pretty onerous. And there just needs to be much, much more investment in the programs and the people who do that work. And that infrastructure, we have a lot of it in the Hudson Valley. In fact, I work with Cornell Cooperative Extension on a program to bring those folks together, and they've got a plan. What they don't have is moolah.
Mhm.
I think it's really important too to, like, you know, we're talking about getting rid of red tape in the process for some of these NYSERDA programs. I have experienced this myself. I did weatherization. I put spray foam in my own house through a NYSERDA loan that I'm paying back on my utility bill. And, you know, it wasn't just me that was caught up in the bureaucracy. It was also my contractor, who was like one of the few contractors who was willing to engage with this NYSERDA process in my local area. And he was like, I'll hold your hand. It's okay. It's a pain in the, et cetera. I'm going to be nice to the radio folks who might be rebroadcasting this and try not to cuss too much. But, you know, this is hard for people to navigate, but even for the professionals that are like solo professionals out here in the rural areas, it usually is solo professionals that are trying to deal with, you know, navigating these NYSERDA programs and doing the installations. It's difficult. Melissa just dropped in the chat that there's going to be a new program in the state called Clean Energy Hubs, which I, as a reporter, am very curious and have an eyebrow up about. The Clean Energy Hubs to kind of dispatch to all of the regions of the state expertise and outreach in communities in partnership with various community groups, expertise about clean energy, about weatherization, about all kinds of energy topics that people can access. And I think it sounds like a great idea. I'm slightly like looking at this going, well, you know, all of these regions are very large. You know, I'm in Delaware County, I'm part of the southern tier, and you know, my nearest big city in the southern tier is Binghamton, and it's far away from where I'm at. And the idea that I would like go to Binghamton to go to a clean energy hub to talk to somebody is like, it might as well be the moon. And so I wonder about these clean energy hubs. How many spokes are they going to have? How far are they going to get down into the
exactly
the clean energy hubs? And we will be hearing, I think, within days, in terms of who, you know, get ready to do those stories, because those announcements are going to be made really soon in terms of who's going to be leading those hubs. And the idea of the hubs really was put forth by a lot of advocates led by environmental justice advocates. In fact, very prominently, the now deceased Cecil Corbin Mark, who used to be with We Act for Environmental Justice. And so it's a beautiful thing and it's happening. The infrastructure to be those hubs, I think we're going to see, what I hope to see between this and the bipartisan infrastructure law is that this begins to build that infrastructure. You know, it is there in some condition, in some places. And I think one of the things that we'll want to see is, can these hubs successfully build that infrastructure? And I hope that they can.
I just want to say too, like, we keep mentioning the bipartisan infrastructure bill, and there's funding in it, and that's great and all. I do know though that like in New York State's planning process, there were a lot of folks that were kind of counting on the Build Back Better funding for climate, a lot of federal funding for climate action, and you know, pushing for renewable energy and U.S. manufacturing and just a whole bunch of other stuff, and as well as consumer side incentives, demand side incentives for things like heat pumps. electric vehicles and, that kind of stuff that, that it's possible that some of that might still come through, but it really got dealt a very large blow. And that, it's got to be crippling to the state's ambitions on this front.
I think that's right. Many folks, federal advocates are still hoping that something will come from the dregs. I think even people were at one point confident that something was going to come from the dregs of Build Back Better, and that seems to be fading with any given day. What I want to quickly mention is that in addition to the gas transition, the other big conversation that's happening at the Climate Action Council is this idea of what are the economy-wide strategies, or how will we pay for this? So there's going to be a conversation happening about carbon pricing. As folks know, with New York Renews, we had a big push behind a polluter penalty bill. So I want to make folks aware that is an active conversation at the Climate Action Council kicking off right now.
One of the things that's interesting that I'm seeing in my area is like people, this county level push for let's not do climate action. In addition to that, they're saying don't do a carbon price, just tax, it should be in the general income tax. So essentially, they're not saying it, but tax the rich, which is also what the Green New Deal folks who are like on the opposite end of the political spectrum from them are saying. So it's just funny to me, hearing calls from literally the opposite ends of the political spectrum saying, how we're going to do climate action, we're going to tax the rich. And then, the carbon price is sort of like the economists, like, this would be great if we could work it out. But it's a little bit more of a middle ground position that seems to be getting battered from both sides. I love it. I'm a big wonk myself. So I love the idea of a carbon pricing where you tax the thing that you want to reduce, and then you give the money back to people, literally sometimes in the form of checks to households. But, it's easy to attack politically.
That's really what's needed, especially at the federal level, but exactly that setup at the federal level, a revenue neutral carbon tax would, really move the needle.
Revenue neutral, meaning the government doesn't keep the money, it gives it back to households.
Yeah.
Many folks, in particular the ones in New York, do not want a carbon neutral one. The CCIA is not that way. I just mention it not to, hey, look, people can have their different ways they look at it, but just that a lot of advocates don't want to see that. They want to see the funds go back in a targeted way to compensate the more low income ratepayers and to pay for other types of programs. Not coming for you, Jen, just mention.
No, it should be progressive. There's no question.
This is where we get into the really hairy conversation. We could have a whole other panel, and I'm hoping people are keeping up with this. This is getting more high level. It's getting more fun. But yeah, there's so many potential ways that we could fund climate action, and they all have their strengths and they all have their pitfalls, and we could argue about them forever. But at some point, somebody's going to have to pay the piper if we're going to get this action done. I did want to touch on the disadvantaged community stuff. Rawa wasn't able to be here with us tonight. I'm so sorry about that. But there's a whole other process. There's a whole other state process for looking at the maps of these disadvantaged communities. They're a little bit of a puzzle to me as a reporter. Like some of them, like Kingston, if you look at the maps, not all of Kingston, it's not like you have a whole municipality like this is a disadvantaged community or not. It's like, if you look at the map of Kingston, some of it is in DAC zones and some of it isn't, and it doesn't seem to make a lot of sense to me as just somebody that knows the city a little bit, but also I don't live there. These maps are going to be experienced very profoundly by people who live in the places that are on the map. And and there's a whole other state process. There's going to be more hearings where people can show up and give a public comment about the maps themselves, about the criteria that the Climate Justice Working Group used to define these disadvantaged communities. They're going to be very important because like Raya said, this is where state funding is going to flow. So it's important to get the definition right. But also they cover so much of the state. if you include all of the map areas plus all of the low-income households that are also included that aren't in a map area, that are part of the disadvantaged communities definition, you've got, I think, close to half the state, right? Over half the state is, included in the DACs. And then we have this directive that 35 to 40% of the funding has to flow to there. And like, does that math add up?
Well, the math. So one of the, and I put the link, and as Lissa knows, the River published my op-ed on the importance of the maps and linking.
I'll post it in the chat. Yes, we did.
Thank you very much. I also put the link to the maps themselves, to the map, at least the searchable map. I just really encourage folks, click on the link, search your zip code, take a look. It's imperfect, it's an imperfect exercise, but it was done with the advice and support of climate justice advocates. There are several different criteria, including race, including income, and the two pieces that they really, from the high level, they parse out are climate vulnerability and environmental burden. Mm-hmm. And so it's both while we both kind of need to drill down on these maps, because I think there are a lot of folks who are, encompassed by them, who maybe aren't, really maybe don't qualify as much as others. And I think there's a lot we need to watch out for there. This broader idea of 45% of the, of lower central Hudson is disadvantaged communities, 45% of New York City, and also large swaths of different places in upstate and other regions of the state. And one of the things I really want to take away when you talk about 45%, we're talking about a lot of people. This is not, and this is one of the things I love to kind of just sort of a shift in frame. We're not talking about a small marginalized group that's like, you've let us out, you've left us behind, who's like asking for things that some may think they deserve, some may think they don't. No, we're talking about the majority, and the disadvantaged communities cutoff is still pretty low. Like, we're talking about really the majority of New Yorkers, and we're talking about how can we make sure we have a just transition that really takes all of us, unless we have a real adoption and real transition for all of us, we're not going to get where we need to be.
It does seem to me, though, that, if they're going to put half of the state in the DAC, they should probably put half the money in the DACs too.
Yeah. Could I just add that a couple of points that so the Hudson Valley is tied with New York City in sort of in terms of the percentage of census tracts that are DACs, 45%.
I just said 45%
right,
in the city,
right,
45%.
Right, and that includes also, census tracts in Greene County and in different parts of the region.
It's mostly southern Westchester, though, New Rochelle, Mount Vernon, Yonkers.
And
Newburgh and Kingston
and
Kingston. No, I'm talking about. No, wait, I'm hearing you, but I'm pushing back for a reason, okay? And was one of the reasons why we made a big push to make sure that in Southern Westchester, we made sure we have one of these disadvantaged community in-person hearings. Because yes, it is true, we have many disadvantaged communities throughout the state, but folks in Westchester, I think, underappreciate, because we have this idea that these sacrifice zones exist in other places, and they don't. They're here in Westchester County. Some of the most climate vulnerable and environmentally burdened areas are in Yonkers, literally. And so and it's not to say there aren't disadvantaged communities throughout the state, because there are, but there is the highest concentration outside of New York City is in this strip where we are right now.
Yeah. Isn't that where they had the water problem in Mount Vernon? The huge sewage disposal problem was centered in Mount Vernon, and recently Governor Hochul went down there to say that they had some money, they were going to get money to do so. I mean, the point that you're making, and I know, Lisa, we're at the halfway point, at the bottom of the hour, but I just wanted to say that this confusion with the definitions of what a DAX is and what an EJ community is has created so much unnecessary upheaval in this process. just because it's centered so much, and Raya, please correct me, and Jen, actually, please correct me if I'm wrong, but because it's centered so much on how monies are allocated per census tract, it's tethered to a flow of money. So the definitions become that much more difficult and legalistic, I guess is the word that I want to use, which I don't know if it's right or it's wrong. It's just an observation that is being made. I also want to make the point that there is, within these definitions, people are still at risk. And so while we do song and dances around the definitions, people still, as you quite rightly put it, people are not getting the kind of relief that they need. And this is a concern, and has to be a concern constantly for people who are in the environmental justice world.
Right. And I think that's a really good point, on that it's not just about the money. DACS, the law prioritizes disadvantaged communities in emissions reductions, in addressing co-pollutants. Environmental impact statements will take DACS into account. So permitting decisions will take that account. And so it's much more than just the funding. And Raya, before we're out of time, we should just say that there are these hearings coming up that people need to participate in. There's one on Thursday, the day after tomorrow, in Poughkeepsie at 6 o'clock. Can you post, or does somebody have the link handy to where people can pre-register and where the dates are for these hearings? It's on the Climate Action Council website. And then Raya, you want to talk about the June 10th hearing too?
Yeah, thank you, Jen. So yes, it's been a real challenge because, there hasn't been a lot of notice. There isn't a lot of, word being spread. And so we're just really trying to do it. But June 10th, there will be a hearing in person at Grace Baptist Church in Mount Vernon. And I and others are going to be more to come. I think we're gonna try and have some conversations, and we're trying to drive folks to the hearing. It's Friday night at 6 p.m. by the way. So just please contact me, contact Climate Auntie if you're willing to come. It's actually a pretty big sacrifice because please commit to join us and come to Mount Vernon at 6 o'clock on Friday night, which I can't imagine a public hearing is probably the last place anyone wants to be. So please show your commitment and join us in Mount Vernon.
You're talking to a bunch of people who showed up to a virtual Zoom hearing in year 2+ of the pandemic to hear people natter on about climate policy. So you might have a little bit of a self-selected audience here. Maybe people will go to these public hearings. You love to see it. Yeah, I just want to thank everybody. It pains me to wrap this up, but I know some of us have to eat dinner and have families and such. I just want to thank you all so much for being part of this. And from my community, which is not identified as a DAC on the map, but which has a lot of vulnerable people, and which I think is on the front lines of climate change. We have devastating floods here. I think everybody in this state has a stake, a real stake in making sure that, not only do we do the transition to clean energy, that seems, objectively important to me as a reporter who cares harder about science facts than about politics facts. That seems clear to me. But also that we do it in a way that is fair, that is equitable, and that doesn't just, sweep aside the concerns of people who already don't have as much power as they should, or as many resources as they should in this state and in its governance. So, I hope that folks who are here with us tonight will, engage with the scoping plan and comment on it. I hope they will have climate conversations in their communities. And I hope they'll write to me and to our panelists, and I hope they'll be in touch with us and with local orgs like Melissa's org, Sustainable Hudson Valley, that are doing interesting climate work on the ground, and having these good faith conversations. These aren't conversations in which everybody agrees and goes, oh yes, we're going to sing Kumbaya and go green. Like, this is hard stuff. This goes to people's lifestyle. It's about energy. It's about how we live our lives. And it's about, political power. And there's tough stuff in the room. And I hope that everybody is going to, bring back to their communities a sense that they can engage with it. So, be in touch, everyone.
Thank you,
everybody.
Lissa, and River Newsroom, and
Thank you.
all of
Thank
the
you.
awesome panelists.
Thank
And read
you.
the River Newsroom.
Read the River
And read the
Newsroom.
River Newsroom.
Great job,
Thanks,
guys.
all.
Talk to you soon. Bye.